Hello, everyone. Warm welcome to all of you joining from around the world. I know we have a lot of people on the line from a lot of different time zones. So good morning, good afternoon, I think even some good evening to you. My name is Anherad Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar entitled Managing Camps in Diverse Contexts, Clinic on Coordination and Implementation Challenges, organized by the Camp Coordination and Camp Management Cluster, CCCM Cluster, and PHAP. This is the third webinar that we are organizing together with the CCCM Cluster on camp management and the draft camp management standards. And I was glad to see many returning participants on the registrant list, as well as I know a lot of people who are joining us today for the first time. So with that, we will turn to the substance of today's event. So although they should be seen as a last resort, camps and other communal settlements are often at the center of humanitarian response, as that is often where those with the greatest needs are concentrated. While standards do exist for many of the technical areas that come together in a camp setting, the same has not been the case for the work of camp managers, who are responsible for coordinating the delivery of protection and assistance in such settings. So in today's session, we'll be looking at some of the practical challenges faced by camp managers, approaches for how to address them, and how the camp management standards can help as a part of that. We've labeled this session for the first time as a clinic, as we will be looking at specific examples that have been provided by registrants to the session. Many of you did take the opportunity to submit cases. We're very grateful for that. And we've made a selection of the cases into 5 themes that we'll look at today: camp coordination, relationships with governments and armed actors, community participation, tensions with host, and decongestion. And to help us walk through these situations, we're joined today by a panel of experts who bring camp management experience from around the world. I'll introduce them now. First, joining us is Kate Holland, CCCM Cluster Coordinator in Iraq. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you with us. Then we have Tom Stork, Global Emergency Specialist with the Danish Refugee Council's EMPACT. That's their Emergency Protection, Assistance, and Coordination team. Thanks for being with us, Tom.
Hi, hello.
And we have with us Veronica Costarelli, CCCM Program Support Officer for the Syrian Cross-Border Humanitarian Response with IOM Turkey. Great to have you, Veronica.
Hi, thank you, everyone.
And we're very glad to have with us again Jennifer Kvernmo, CCCM and Protection Capacity Building Coordinator, who has been instrumental in the development of the camp management standards. Warm welcome to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Hello.
And last but definitely not least, Dare Hayo, the Global CCCM Cluster Coordinator, who will be providing us with his reflections on today's discussions. Great to have you on the line again, Dare. Okay, we'll get your audio back, I'm sure, Dare. No problem there. So before we look at the cases, I just wanted to make sure that everyone in the room is familiar with the background to the camp management standards, as these will keep coming up during this session. Jennifer, as you were part of the discussions that started the development of these standards, I'll ask you, what was the thinking around why something like this was needed for camp management? Over to you, Jennifer.
Well, I mean, I think you said it really well in your introduction, and Harold, you said, that standards exist for all of the other technical sectors, but they haven't existed for camp management, and so they're really long overdue. But more than that, I mean, just the news today about the campfire in Moria is a really awful reminder that, camps are sometimes the only places where people can be assisted, and everyone who's working in a camp or who is responsible in them needs to know how to raise up those rights. And it's increasingly the situation that there's lots and lots of new people that are in charge of managing camps who may not know how to do that. So the standards are there to provide a roadmap and to measure how that work is being done. You can't start with everything on day one, but without them, you'll never know if you've succeeded. And it's finally our chance to have some standards.
Okay, excellent. So the CCCM Cluster already developed a camp management toolkit, which provides quite comprehensive guidance on best practice. So another question before we really get into the cases is to ask you, Jennifer, how are the standards different and how do they relate to the toolkit? Back to you.
Well, you can say that they're the same but different. The Camp Management Toolkit was first started in 2002, and that's about 18 years ago. And they are a collection of best practices and shared ideas and references back to other standards. So in setting out to really focus in on what are the core responsibilities of the camp management team, we were looking to find our own way what needed to be done in a camp setting by the main team managing the sites. And you can say that also in those 18 years since the Camp Management Toolkit was drafted that a lot has changed. You know, we've had humanitarian form, which has changed the coordination function, which has changed funding methods, which has changed evaluation and monitoring and advocacy. So we have a lot of different scenarios that were included and that our responsibilities now focus on. So if we didn't have standards and we didn't know where to go to, then they would be very hard to cross-reference. So what we've done with the new Camp Management Toolkit, the new Camp Management Standards, is make references back to the toolkit so that they're interconnected, that you can see the line between them. They need to be able to be elaborated on in the Camp Management Toolkit, but sometimes you need just a really precise form of measurement. So that's why they're different, but also
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And very briefly, what has the consultation process of the standards been like? Back to you, Jennifer.
The consultation process has been great. It's actually really nice to see a lot of people who've participated in the consultations here on the call today, and you can see some of the pictures that are coming up. You know, it's been like talking to family because it's been a way to reinforce the essential actions that need to be in place, but it's also been a way to make sure that we can get differentiation around different typologies. You know, we just finished the last round of consultations on Zoom a couple weeks ago, and they had participants from Mexico all the way to Argentina talking about transit sites and evacuation centers, which are really different than planned camps. And so it's been a way to kind of reconnect with family and to use them and pilot them in different settings and to make sure that they could stand up to different environments, different countries, different contexts, and still provide the guidance that was lacking.
Great. And then finally, just to clarify, how would you describe the scope of these standards? They're titled Camp Management Standards, but what about other settings apart from camps where there are displaced people? Do they apply there as well? Back to you, Jennifer.
That's a great question. I think we struggle a little bit in CCCM to really come up with the right term to be inclusive when we talk about collective temporary accommodation, because it's not always a row of tents in a line, which is a camp. It can also be a collective center, which is a kind of repurposed building. It can also be an evacuation site, which can be a school or a purposely built building that can be used temporarily for fires or floodings, and it can be transit sites. So whether it's 5 families living in an unfinished building like they've defined in Iraq, or it's 180,000 families like in the big mega camp in Bangladesh, these are standards for all of those different temporary accommodations, and they're supposed to be differentiated slightly from the ways in which the scale or the scope would be needed to be able to expand those services to all the different diversity of technology.
Okay, thank you. And I understand that the final draft of the standards has just been completed, and we are launching a survey today for all of the participants in this webinar to provide views on the final draft before it is finalized. You should see a link to this now. I know there was also a discussion about it just a moment ago in the chat, but we've put the link up there now on the screen, and I do hope that all of you participating today will complete that survey after the event. It's very important to get your input on the final draft before it is completed. So before we move on to the cases, Jennifer, would you like to come in with any other final remarks on the validation, the finalization process of the standards?
No, just to encourage as many people as possible to take the survey and to give us this final bit of feedback. It's been a really rewarding process, but we want to validate it and to make sure that it's meeting the needs of both camp management agencies and practitioners, but also people that are working. So we really value the partnership with PHAP and look forward to receiving feedback. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jennifer. So with that, I will jump straight into the challenges in camp management that have been submitted by participants today. So our first area concerns decongesting overcrowded camps and how to best go about communicating to camp residents about this. So we have a participant working with an NGO in Nigeria who submitted a case, and I'll just read this out. It's also on the screen. Here in Nigeria, we have several times had to try to decongest overcrowded camps. In trying to motivate camp residents to move from congested site to site extensions, it has proven very challenging, as the perception is that the security in the site extensions is worse and that they are further away from amenities such as distribution sites and healthcare facilities. While we have, of course, been focusing on communication and community engagement, including ensuring informed consent, this remains a major challenge. Is there any specific messaging or ways of working that has worked for other colleagues in the past in similar situations? So a great question, great case. I'd like to turn with this first to Kate. What would be your main overarching recommendations for how to approach this type of situation? Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much. I think probably a very familiar scenario for a lot of people who work in camp management and a lot of people on this call. And I also think it's one of the very relatable things that we do is as CCCM practitioners, I'm sure that if someone came along and told me that I had to move, I also would be quite reluctant to do so. I wanted to pick up on two things in this question. Firstly, the point that the question raises and sort of emphasizes about community consultation. And then secondly, some more reflections and practical examples from teams that I've worked with that have faced pretty much this exact challenge, although not in Nigeria. I think, firstly, the point that the example gives and emphasizes the importance of communication and community engagement, I think probably can't really be overemphasized. It's something that is sort of central to the new camp management standards. And I think also an opportunity that we sometimes don't often take, especially when we're looking at this site planning stage, as a link between how we design space with people as well as for people. I think often it's something that maybe isn't possible at the start, but there are sort of opportunities throughout the site planning process and sort of up into and when people are moving to really be able to focus on that and sort of trying to get that real community engagement in the process rather than just at the end of the process, as the example in Nigeria highlights. So then, practically, examples of this. I think when I've been working and recently in Iraq, was working with a team trying to move, sort of do the opposite and consolidate camps and move people there. Some of the things that the team that I was working with were thinking about and trying to engage in is really trying to understand who is concerned about what. I think a lot of the times when we speak to community leadership, even to community committees, we get a very specific perspective, often men, however much we try to increase women's voices. So understanding who's concerned about what and what perspectives we're hearing. Is it the perspectives of men? What are women thinking about it? Elderly people, especially as in the Nigeria example, obviously the security in the site is something that's highlighted. And related to that, whether there are any community influences as well. So of the voices we're hearing or of the influence within the community, is that kind of positive or negative influence? So in a recent example in Iraq that I was mentioning, we were working on a camp consolidation process and realizing after speaking a lot with the community and different community members that some of the reluctance of people to move was driven by specific individuals' interests within that, which is something that the team who were working in the camp wouldn't have gotten to understand without spending a lot of time sitting down with women, having a cup of tea, etc., and really sort of delving into that. Other things that the team were asking themselves and then working with the community to try and understand was there any mitigating measures that could be put in place. So understanding the community concerns in this situation, issues with security, could increase fencing, increase lighting, etc., help mitigate the issues around there. Similarly with things like distance from distribution sites, whether there are any ways in which people with less mobility, so elderly people, persons with disabilities, could be supported to access that. And to try and really understand what the community concerns are and then work with them and then with the other partners as well to try and address them as much as possible. Obviously with that, there's with additional infrastructure needs additional funding, so then we start to tap into the advocacy side of the camp management responsibility. The Iraq example that I was mentioning was camp consolidation, so closing down specific sectors of the camp as people were leaving and then moving people back towards the center. Some things that worked there, and people were reluctant to leave the shelters they'd set up, reluctant to leave very spacious sectors of the camp as other families had left, was getting people to move as an extended group, allowing them to select their own shelter plots, and a lot of go and see visits. So both community leaders, but then in this case it was quite a small camp, allowing families themselves, heads of household, and women as well in particular, to go and visit the sectors that they were moving into with members of the camp management team, speak to the people who have become their new neighbours and see the services. And just touching briefly on another example from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which perhaps is more adjacent to the Nigeria example, was working there a couple of years ago when the decongestion effort started from very high density areas that were often at risk of floods and landslides, and the camp management teams there were trying to work to move people to newly developed areas at the edge of the camp. And they had very similar concerns. Security issues of being on the perimeter of the camp, lack of access to services, particularly in the areas where services were still being put in. Tom, who is also on the panel, might also have some reflections on this, because he spent quite a lot of time working specifically on this in Cox's Bazar. So what worked with that was a lot of repeated community engagement. So people didn't want to leave their extended family groups they settled with, and understanding that, we're able to then move people as very large units. Repeated go and see visits to the new area and to new services, discussion of benefits of the area, and then introduction to the service providers who were going to be there, and then also discussing with them the future plans of what the new areas would look like. So with that, I would hand over, I guess, either to Tom to continue on the Cox's Bazar example, or back to you and Harrod.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. I'd like to ask Jennifer if she could come in just briefly on this, just to say a couple words about what the standards would have to say about this kind of situation or this kind of challenge. Over to you, Jennifer.
Well, I think it's an interesting dilemma because the problem of decongestion is where all of the different sectors are kind of coming together in relationship to the needs of the population. And so what you're talking about is creating a safe environment, and what Kate was saying about participation was really relevant. So you need to have the confidence of the community that their safety is your first and foremost concern, and then to consult with them so that they have confidence in that you're shifting them to another area can help be beneficial for them from a safety perspective. So like she was saying with the example from Nigeria and her work in Bangladesh, whenever you're trying to shift people, you have to really work on a community participation method and to make sure that the standards are talking directly to the people's needs. And so the camp management standards would show from the representation and the communicating with the community to creating a safe environment, how the camp management team could work together on those social issues that are butting up against the safety issues and the technical issues of the site planning, which is too dense.
Great, thanks a lot, Jennifer. Yes, let's turn to Tom to come in on this kind of situation. Over to you, Tom. You have the floor.
Yes, no, I agree with a lot of what Kate has said, and also worked on the Bangladesh relocations. I do think the importance of the go and see visits were instrumental in making sure that the kind of rumours or worries as to the new camp areas were reduced, and ensuring that it was a large enough group that you had mixed opinions on what was lacking in those new areas. And then I would say particularly around the actual process of relocation, I think there was, as we've said, issues around fear of the security at the new site, but there was also fear around the actual process of relocation. So we try to combat that through moving whole blocks at the same time, or if not whole blocks, very large groups of people, and providing a huge amount of support during that trip. At first, we used coaches and trucks. They destroyed the road, so we had to walk them across the camp. It's nearly a 2-hour walk, and that meant employing a very large number of porters. So for say we move 50 households, it would be 5 porters a household. That's nearly 250 porters. A system of luggage tags, stretchers, umbrellas, water, and one thing that we found worked quite well is that we would start very, very early, avoiding the heat of the day, and also in reducing bottlenecks. I think once people started to sit around, or if they were waiting for long times, they would start to worry, be out in the sun. And so we spent a lot of time in reducing the bottlenecks. And then again, I agree that on their reception, they need to be moved in as quickly as possible, and be able to sort of get themselves back on their feet as quickly as possible. And what we found is that once we had a small number of successful relocations, with additional go and see visits to see how they had settled in, we got more community acceptance to the point where we were actually having to say, hold back. Hang on, we can't take everyone all at once.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Tom. Really appreciate that. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next area. We have, again, 5 areas to go through today. Our next area concerns how camp managers relate to governments and armed actors. Local governments are, of course, one of the most important, if not the most important, stakeholder in many camp settings. But as with any stakeholder, relationships with them can be challenging. Our first example in this area comes from a registrant working for a UN agency in Nigeria, who writes, "In our IDP camp in Borno State, we have had incidents occurring with armed personnel harassing the camp populace, even though the role of armed personnel is to ensure safety and protection of the camp. But they continue to use their uniforms and presence of arms to instill fear in the IDP population. While the Army should, of course, be addressing these issues, they continue to persist. This is compounded by having fewer than needed site facilitators, and many partners are not active in the camp. The main challenge for a camp manager like myself is who to report this type of incident to, and then, of course, how to best address it without causing more harm." So, Veronica, turning to you first on this, what would be your recommendation to this participant? Over to you.
Thank you. Well, usually it is the role of OCHA, more specific of the Civil Military Coordination Team of focal point in country, to liaise directly with government or armed actor on behalf of the humanitarian community. However, in complex emergency, it might happen that OCHA won't have full capacity to deal on a daily basis on localized issues occurring in camps and in light camp setting. In that case, you need to understand which issue must be escalated because it requires the intervention of OCHA, and what kind of issue you can perhaps try to mitigate, talking directly with the local authorities. Just to give you an example, actually we face a lot of this issue when I was working in Iraq during the Mosul response. Back in time I was a cluster coordinator, and several camp managers were facing issues relating to the engagement with armed actors because they were interfering with camp's operation. Therefore, OCHA team were, as much as they were helping, they couldn't deal on a daily basis with our camp issues. And so also because there were so different types of local authorities. We had the state actors, no state actors, and even like a different subgroup. So they were very difficult even for us to identify those and refer to OCHA. And so what I advocate to the camp manager was the following. Firstly, it is very important to have a stakeholder analysis, understanding if these are state actors, no state actors. Understanding who they are and what they represent, including community, ethnicity, is extremely important. Because based on that, you can also setting up a communication strategy with the aim of emphasizing the civilian character of the camps and on the humanitarian principle. In the case in Iraq, for example, we managed after several attempts to establish few rules and regulations, for example. If they had a specific local authority wanted to visit the camps, they needed to inform ahead of time the camp manager, even to share the information of the purpose of the visit. Another issue that we manage well is to agree on no weapon allowed policy. So nobody were able to get inside the camps with weapon. Of course, we couldn't stop everybody because when you're having a complex emergency, it's very difficult also to trying to solve issues that are related to camps and not a camp setting. However, we at least mitigate some of those. Another important initiative that I think was very successful is to create a referral pathway and also an incident matrix where CCCM, protection, and OCHA were all working together, trying to record all the incidents that were occurring in camps that they were involving also armed actors. And through this reporting line, you are able to actually analyze the trends. And so when specific incidents were occurring quite often, that was the moment you actually were able to build up a case, and then you report to OCHA, and then you can scale up those issues to the relevant stakeholders. If you don't have these incidents, incident reporting matrix or referral matrix or whatever, it's very difficult to understand if sometimes you have only one incident might occasionally happen or not. And sometimes you also be able to analyze if there were specific groups that were always involved in this type of incident. Another thing, for example, and this is, I would say, some suggestion that I give when I was deployed in Iraq. In the case of Northwest Syria, at the moment I'm actually piloting a camp management standard in remote management. And we are working in a very challenging and dynamic environment. And we are working on the ground through our implementing partners to support affected community living in camps and camp setting. Therefore, it is extremely important to support the implementing partners in interacting with local authorities in the most principled way, and to develop also clear and consistent messages to the local authorities in order to avoid confusion and misunderstanding, which could jeopardize the operation and also their position. So I've been advocating for a long time now that it is very important to have to develop also training for camp managers on how to best engage with local authorities, because quite often camp managers are exposed and they are always being the first page to liaise with local authorities, especially on behalf of some partners that are working in a camp. So having a skilled and qualified camp managers is extremely important, and they will feel also more comfortable even when specific issue might happen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Veronica. I would also like to bring in Dare on this example. Dare, do you have any reflections regarding the protection angle on this situation? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Indeed, regardless the context and the situations, camps are and remain attractive spots for armed groups. It has happened in all the countries where we have been operating in, even it does not count if it is a conflict situation or if it is a natural disaster. Addressing these issues of military actors trying to interfere and commit potential violations in camps remains extremely sensitive and complicated. The role of the local authorities, and in particular also the role of the host communities, is essential and critical in these kind of circumstances. Taking up from what Veronica mentioned just, is a good camp management setup and a good camp coordinator will definitely help in setting and establishing clear mechanisms, first with all the concerned actors, regardless if they are armed or unarmed actors, and building strong ties with the host communities. But also, for and foremost, having a clear and sufficient complaint and feedback mechanisms, so the actors who are mandated to address these issues, the actors who have already established channels, will be able to follow up and track the incidents if they happen. Because it is also important, these channels, to track the incidents, otherwise it will have some serious reputational risks on the service providers in these camps. It has happened in many contexts where if these things are delayed to be addressed, it will imply some serious reputational risk on the actors. The sensitivity is also important for us to make sure that any data on these issues and on these violations are treated in a very ultimate confidentiality. And in the meantime, to train and to sensitize the different actors operating in the camps, including the camp communities, on knowing how to address this. Otherwise, it might imply security risks on the foremost on the camp residents and on the services and as well as the staff of the camp managers. As it has been mentioned that OCHA has the ultimate mandate to address this issue, but in many, many locations, the fact of having a good camp coordinator and the committees have been always able to address these issues proactively and by stopping them happening, by reaching proactively to different actors, military actors in the areas where we are operating and asking them to sign that they will not be involved in any kind of violations. They will not interfere, but more also to make them aware and informed by humanitarian actors are building on humanitarian principles where we are not there to violate any of these principles. We are based there to help the people based on their needs. And these kind of proactive issues have been happening in all the key contexts where we had severe conflicts, from Somalia to Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria, where there are very strong armed groups where with the leadership of OCHA's mandate and the protection cluster, and of course direct involvements with the camp coordinators, these actors proactively were asked to sign on documents where they are declining themselves from interfering, and also establishing with them clear communication measures and channels to immediately address these issues if and should they happen. I will not continue with many other examples. With this, over to you, Ingrid, and thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Dare. And finally, Jennifer, can the camp management standards help us in a situation like this, or is this a gap in the current standards? Over to you.
I don't think it's a gap at all, because the humanitarian standards are a drawing direct line from the humanitarian charter, and that humanitarian action is connected to humanitarian law. And I think they're international humanitarian law, and I think that we can see that we're respecting rights, and we're standing on protection principles, that all these things work together. I really, feel for the colleagues in Nigeria, because that's been one place where there's been quite a lot of attack on civilians, and it has been used for that. ICRC lost staff. Staff was just lost in June from our organization, and so I think we can feel very, very closely how urgent this question is and how important it is. But we all need to stand up for rights in this way, and to say that humanitarian assistance is meant for civilians, and that we're not a target. So I think that the standards really do speak to this quite clearly.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that, Jennifer. We'll move on to a second example under this theme. Our second example concerns a participant working with an NGO in Iraq who is faced with local government trying to be involved in areas of management in ways that might not be suitable. So I'll read it out here. In our day-to-day work in managing camps here, the biggest challenge can often be the intervention from the local government in management matters, including requesting data related to the camp and its residents, and insisting on the presence of armed actors in the camp to ensure security. Given that the relationship with local governments is often problematic along these lines in many locations, how can we approach this in the best way? Tom, I'll turn to you first for this example. What would be your recommendation for someone in a situation like this? Over to you.
Yeah, I think looking at the question, the question really is two questions. One is around requests of data, and the other is presence of armed actors. So I will split them up, and then I will tie them together at the end. For the request of data, this is something that we have, I am sure, all faced. I don't think there is a context where requests from local authorities for data has not occurred. On the surface, camp managers should be able to fall back either onto their own organization's data protection policies and SOPs, or if the cluster has them in place. However, for local authorities, that is very unlikely to work as either a block or as a way of establishing a relationship. So then how do we approach that? I would say ensuring that all of your team members are briefed and fully understand data confidentiality and this is linked to the new standards document, in which it looks at the percentage that have received CCCM training, which should include data confidentiality and data sharing aspects. I think ensuring that data is stored securely so that it isn't accidentally leaked, say through Dropbox links. I think too often we have unprotected Excel documents in Dropbox, which is actually quite dangerous. And so that's around preventing it being leaked. I would say certainly the role of the cluster in creating a common stance to those requests is key. I have certainly faced examples where a local authority has said, why won't you give me this information? I've received it from these other two organizations, and they didn't put up a fuss. They didn't argue back. And having the cluster come together to then create that common stance to say, no, household level information is never shared, is key. Often what I have often found is the people requesting the information are actually requesting it on behalf of their higher authorities, and quite understandably, they don't want to go back to the office with a no. And so the cluster engaging then with the sort of higher levels of local authority management and stemming some of those requests is certainly key. There is also, and I use the example from Bangladesh, which is, I know, is a very different setup from Iraq, but is also asking why they want the information and understanding what they want to do with it. I found in Bangladesh we were receiving a very large number of requests for household level data. And at first, it was assumed that it is because there may have been sinister or sinister intentions. But actually, after having talked to the CICs, it was clear they actually didn't really want the household level information. They just wanted the aggregated values because they were being asked for it from their own managers. And so providing aggregated information as opposed to data, and understanding that sometimes the people requesting data may lack in basic data literacy, may not actually really know what they're necessarily asking for. Moving to the armed groups, it highlights, I think, that in many contexts, well, in every context, we are in a supporting role. We are providing, maybe tying back to the example of Bangladesh, it was very clear that the government was in control and we were there to support. And so when they're not even requesting, but basically demanding that armed groups are in the camps. And I know this was discussed in the last case study, so I won't spend as long on it. Again, I would come back to the need for a cluster red line and a cluster common stance. And I would again, you have the examples of, well, in the camp down the road, they allow armed groups in. So why can't we come into here? Next, I would say, is how to advocate when things go wrong, when there are when issues arise from the presence of armed groups, and how they are funneled to the cluster, and how the cluster can then advocate at a country level. And I think the two examples highlight the the challenges of working in a supporting role. I know we often see camp management as, this is my camp, it is an island onto itself, and it doesn't or shouldn't have to necessarily follow the country's laws and regulations. But ultimately, we are actually working for or in support of the authorities, and building a relationship with them is key. And so for the data example, not just saying no, but actually starting to understand what they want and what they want to use it for, and actually is there a middle ground.
Right. Great. Thanks so much, Tom. I'd like to turn to Kate as well on this case. Kate, over to you.
Thanks. I've been from an Iraq cluster perspective. I've been writing notes, including from the previous discussion with Veronica, and there are additional things that we can potentially try in Iraq to help address this problem. I wanted to touch on a couple of things that Tom was saying, to elaborate a bit on what's being tried and some of the continuing challenges we have. I think one of the things that Tom was highlighting, and Tom, I am glad you did, was the role of the cluster in this, which also 16 in the chat was highlighting in Iraq. So I think it's a really good example, and as Veronica was saying earlier, of using the camp coordination function. So what is being tried in Iraq is essentially taking the pressure off camp management, and off the teams in the camp, who are mostly the ones receiving requests for data, mostly the ones who are receiving armed actors into the camp, and passing that responsibility back up to the cluster. So the cluster has, indeed, as you were saying, Tom, the cluster has a policy on this, and so the individuals within the camp, so the camp managers, the camp officers, are then able to say, it's not their decision, they're following the policy of the cluster, and take quite a bit of the pressure off them then. I think Veronica's point earlier about training is also a really important one, and I've been writing that down. One thing we have found useful here is training and explanation to the different local authorities on roles and responsibilities, on the humanitarian principles, to help explain why camp management is not answering these data requests, which then is something that we can refer back to again and again. But possibly we need to focus a bit more as well on training our camp management teams in order to be able to deal with often quite difficult situations. And one of the difficulties we face, which I'm sure is not unique to Iraq, is uncoordination or lack of coordination between government bodies. So sometimes one government department or security actor will come along and request data from camp management or data from the camp population that, in fact, one of their other counterparts hold. So there's a lot of, and as much as we try to keep good coordination within the humanitarian sector, sometimes we're also dealing with difficulties in coordination with our government counterparts. And so with that, and I think finally what's been useful, as Veronica was saying earlier as well, is having consistency between multiple humanitarian stakeholders. So the CCCM Cluster, Camp Coordination, has a position on it that's echoed by camp management, and then the OCHA helps back up as well. But in Iraq now, we're still clearly facing this problem, but benefiting from several years' worth of attempts to make this sort of official policy. And Harad, back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Just a quick note to mention, we're getting some great inputs from participants in the upper left-hand corner, that poll where we're asking what your main advice would be in each case. Please do keep that coming in, and we will be incorporating all of those inputs into the event follow-up. So we have a third example in this category that I'd like to turn to now. This deals more with conveying the value of camp management to local government and gaining their acceptance. Someone working with an NGO in Somalia writes the following. In contexts where the displaced population live in informal settlements, like in Somalia, local authorities are often skeptical about the added value of CCCM. They feel that CCCM agencies take away their role and often struggle to see the benefit of the technical support and transfer of knowledge from the CCCM agency to them. Capacity building sessions always help, especially from a long-term point of view, but at the start of the operations, the CCCM agencies often face many difficulties in the relation with camp administration. In these situations, what can we do to gain acceptance from camp administration? I'll come right back to you on this, Kate, as it's related, I think, to your earlier comments. Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, this is tied together very nicely, I think. I think, again, something that certainly feels very familiar to me. I've not worked in Somalia, but I read this example and certainly sympathized. I think often there's a difficulty in explaining CCCM. And actually, when I was reading the standards document, hoping that having something like that will actually really help. I know I sometimes struggle to explain what CCCM is. It's not tangible. Explaining why you're putting a latrine in is one thing, but coordination is sometimes seen both as undermining and then also as unnecessary if someone doesn't understand the benefit of it. I think for me, it really emphasizes the importance of relationships. And someone was saying to me the other day that camp management works best when everyone plays their role, and really having to work with not just partners in the community, but also the local authorities to try and figure out what the problems are, and then, try and make sure everyone is playing the role. I think with that, there's a lot of time investment that's needed. The example mentions training, which obviously is really important, but often is quite a later step when people understand the context a bit more, understand humanitarian response. I think this problem often is one when humanitarian response is new to a situation, and certainly one when that's more of an issue that arises in outside of traditional camps. It's very easy to see the role of camp management when you have a row of tents in a line and new services being established, but a lot more difficult in informal sites, particularly in informal sites in urban contexts. So I think for me, what has been a useful reflection in addressing this kind of issue is that relationship building, trying to understand from the local authorities what problems they face, and to use that as a hook to try and explain how CCCM or how a CCCM team could help them address that. And I think what Tom was saying earlier as well, in situations where the local authorities are really taking the lead, seeing our role as supportive to that, and trying to explain and frame the value add of CCCM, maybe taking some specific problems and starting to work with them rather than explaining everything all in one go as you might do in a formal training situation. And I guess coming with that is the demonstration that it's supportive and not undermining. I think, again, hopefully the standards will help with that explanation of CCCM as a tangible thing. And then specifically with the different roles of camp administration and camp management, that it's a complement and not a duplication. And that, it's a complement and not a duplication, and help with the contextualization as well. And so really understanding the local context, the needs, the issues faced by the authorities, and how we can try to address that. Back over to you.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Kate. So we're going to move on to our next theme. We've received several situations related to community participation in camp management. The first example from a participant in an NGO in Nigeria concerns women's participation. This participant writes the following: while we have set up the structures for community engagement and accountability in the camps here in Nigeria, we are facing a persistent challenge with women much less likely to participate as they are facing a patriarchal culture that discourages their engagement. This is the case both for various camp activities as well as for decision-making processes for camp residents. How can we go about increasing women's participation in leadership and decision-making in a culturally challenging context such as this? Tom, if I could turn to you on this, what would be your advice for how to approach it? Over to you.
Hi, yes. Again, I would certainly split this into two. One is around camp activities, and then the other is around leadership, decision-making, governance. So for activities and for governance, the question is, yes, one of the blocks is the patriarchal culture, but and I'm sure this has been done, but running focus group discussions that ask actually what women within the camps want to do, but also aside from the patriarchal culture, what is blocking them from attending. So certainly things like, is there space? Can the activity be undertaken in a private space? Is there a plan in place for things like childcare? And do they feel safe within that space? The much larger question is in leadership and decision making, and what I have previously kind of witnessed, especially in Bangladesh, is that the idea of leadership and decision making is this often very formal structure. We will create a committee or committees, an imam committee, a male committee, a female, a youth committee. People will be voted in and will have these very official roles. And I certainly think that not just for women, but for many other groups in camps, that can be far too much of a commitment, but also be a very daunting process, and one in which they may have never had any previous experience. And so I think that very formal leadership and decision-making structure is often only really beneficial to a relatively small group within a camp, which is the traditional leaders, the more confident, those that are used to having some form of leadership. And so alternatives to decision making and leadership can come around not necessarily through committees, but things like creating groups that don't require voting. In Bangladesh, there was an initiative, if I remember correctly, that was linked to listening sessions, and then following the listening sessions, there was then informal discussions held with those that had attended around issues pertinent to their area of the camp. And so I certainly think breaking away from very formalized governance structures and allowing things to be slightly less formal is key for the participation of everyone within the governance structure, not just women. And then coming back to the camp activities, it really is about finding the things that they wish to do and providing them in that safe environment. So I know in Bangladesh, there was initiatives run around the weaving of bamboo to create sheets, which was a paid a paid position, but it was something that could be done effectively in a covered location. So that meant it was safe for children to be there if they were being looked after, but also they were not, they could not be looked upon whilst conducting the activity. And so one of the ways in which the camp management standard is trying to address this is moving slightly away from some of the more formal indicators, things like, for example, I've had contracts where, as a camp manager, one of the indicators was how many committees have you formed? But the question then is, well, are the committees actually working? Are people actually having representation and a voice through that structure? In many cases, the answer was no. And so changing the indicators to be more changing the indicator to be much more around, say, perception, the percentage of people who surveyed, do they feel that they have a voice? And I know that's something that was changing in the last draft. But yeah, I can wrap up. I can conclude, because I know it is getting on in the webinar. For the camp activities, it is about asking what do they want to do, but providing that safe space in order to do it. Secondly, for leadership and governance, it is breaking down these very formal committee structures and looking at alternatives. As I said, these listening groups, then followed by discussions. Yeah, that is essentially it. And I guess for camp activities is not just suggesting sewing machines, as is often the blanket response to the ideas of activities.
Very good. Thank you so much, Tom. And yes, excellent point regarding indicators. Much appreciated there. And some great inputs as well from participants. Thank you for that. And do keep those coming in. We have a second example on community participation, which deals with a slightly different kind of situation. When camp residents are not staying longer term, maintaining participatory structures becomes more challenging. A participant working with an NGO in Honduras writes the following. In Honduras, we are facing a situation where there is a huge turnover of individuals in transit sites. One of the key challenges I am facing is being able to create community participation structures in this situation, such as a community council. As people are in general not staying for long while new people are coming in, there is no continuity of people who know the rules and who can teach newcomers how to respect them. Any advice on how to approach this kind of situation would be welcome. Veronica, could I turn to you regarding this example? Over to you.
Sure. Well, firstly, it is important to understand that community participation structure should be established according to the displacement site typology. So at this regard, the new camp management standard explains well the differences between a transit site versus planned camp, spontaneous camps, and collective center and informal site. Generally speaking, transit and reception sites are temporary accommodation built to host affected community at the beginning of an emergency. Therefore, they are usually a short-term shelter solution. On the other hand, and this is when things get tricky, the community participation is a long-term process which requires in-depth understanding of the local context, social dynamics, tradition, and culture. And most of all, it requires to build the trust between providers and community, but also between community and community leaders. Now, due to the nature of the transit site, it is very challenging to set up a community structure, as we usually do in planned camps, that they give a longer-term shelter solution versus a transit site. Therefore, a different approach must be in place. And for example, instead of establishing a community council or committees to share information, you can, for example, assess and understand the existing participation structure and power dynamics that your community has from the moment that you reach the site. For example, it will be very good also to keep the same social structure when you can. In Syria, for example, we have cases when a whole community is moving inside a transit site, and so they already have the head of the tribe is already the community representative. So usually the people sometimes feel comfortable if the camp manager is liaising and passing messages through to the head of tribe. And it is also very important to integrate and use the traditional communication channels that specific community has been using. So I know that we have been using a lot of Facebook group chat, while in specific contexts this is a very good tool to keep using. In other contexts, like for example in specific area in Syria, there is not good services, so therefore you cannot share information based only on group chat. I prefer establishing a two-way communication strategy to ensure that when you are sharing information to the community and all individuals are reached. And how you can do that? For example, you can have outreach officers that are going inside the site, the transit site, and talking to different individuals in different sector of the site all the time. In the case you are trying to establishing you are building the trust with the community, and you don't need the necessary, again, build up committees. You can also establish various focus group discussions to talk to women, to elderly, to youth, to men, and then trying to pass the messages on the rule and regulation of the camps. One very important thing that actually very useful thing we are doing in northern West Syria is that once the people reach the transit site, immediately the camp management team explain to them which are the rules and regulations of the site. And we explain to them not only through written form, but also talking to the community and explain, because we need to reach those people that are illiterate and they might not have access to written information. So, and in this way you try to involve on a weekly basis different individuals and also establishing different type of activities. So this is to say that when we're talking about community structure, it is very important to set up a sort of light approach when it comes to transit site, because you also want to avoid to raise expectations over the community. Now, having community that actually are empowered to make some decision on a daily basis is something that you must likely able to see in planned camps or in a longer shelter solution. While in transit site, when you have a huge turnover of people, it's very difficult to even get feedback and change sometimes the services provision, because everybody considers the site as a temporary. And so always understand the context and do not expect that you need to establish. Having community participation structure doesn't mean necessarily that you need to establish community council and committees. Participation involves communication and involves also engagement with individuals at every level. And you can do that also by simply talking on a daily basis with the community in the camps, in the transit site. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Very helpful indeed. We're going to move on to our next theme. We want to try not to go over time here. We'll do our best. We're going to move on to another area that has been raised by many of you. Many registrants submitted cases, challenges on this theme concerning tensions with host communities and different types of issues also related to land ownership. So the first example we'll look at concerns land ownership. A participant working with a UN agency in Yemen faces the following situation. We are facing an overall challenging situation with managing a camp that is established on land owned by different tribes, each with varying interests, and where the authorities have little or no say on the land usage. Normally, we don't engage directly with tribes, which makes operation very difficult, particularly when you want to improve camp infrastructures such as roads, electricity, playgrounds, and even conducting care and maintenance. Given this starting point, what would be our best approach to improve the situation? Tom, I'll turn to you on this first, as you are currently working on the situation in Yemen. What do you make of this case as presented? Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, this is an incredibly difficult question. And so I will certainly attempt to answer it, but I would also hope others will jump in afterwards. So as I said in the previous case study that I covered, in many examples, particularly that of Bangladesh, we are in a supporting role of the local authorities. But then what happens when the authorities either have potentially no access themselves or no interest in involvement in things like land ownership? So the question then is who does hold the power? And some very basic stakeholder analysis as a starting point is certainly a way of identifying within those tribes who is holding power. But then the question of engagement, and normally we don't directly engage with tribes, ultimately there has to be some form of engagement. Now, whether that engagement is through other is through other people, is through host community, is potentially through even members of the camp population. There has to be an engagement, because if not, that situation won't improve. In terms of the issue of how to improve camp infrastructure, what I would say is it is key, especially in where you have small camps, often within or next to other villages, other urban areas, where they're not really these discrete, and I'm thinking of Iraq, where some of the camps can be really in the middle of nowhere, if not to look to improve the camp infrastructure, but to improve the area infrastructure. But that can have serious ramifications on budgets and does need to be highlighted through advocacy to the donors when, in order to, say, build a kilometre of road through the camp, you have to build another 5 kilometres around it to improve the general area. And that's certainly been the case for WASH. We saw that in Bangladesh as well, having to build WASH infrastructure within the host community. But yeah, certainly as a starting point is the basic stakeholder analysis. Through that, then identifying how your talking points can be communicated to tribes, or at least to the host community, and certainly however much in my previous example that I was advocating for less committees, I do think host community committees can work, and they certainly worked within in other contexts that I've worked in, because they begin to feel heard of, they begin to feel listened to, and then finally to change that idea of improving camp infrastructure to improving the area infrastructure, despite the ramifications that can have on budgets. Does anyone else want to jump in on that one? Because it is,
it is a tough one indeed, Tom. I see, we have a couple of inputs from participants, which is great. Thanks for sharing those. Let's see, I'm not seeing any of our fellow panelists here interested in coming in, so perhaps we'll move on. But thanks so much, Tom, for the valiant effort on that indeed very difficult situation. So we'll move on to our next example under this theme. The second one that we selected was of a type shared actually by a number of people writing in, where there is an overall tension with the host community. A participant working with an NGO in Myanmar writes the following: "We are facing a situation of serious tension with the host community around the camp. We are receiving frequent complaints from people in the surrounding villages that the camp dwellers are provided with all the facilities while the host communities are not, and they are facing struggles with their daily lives. What kinds of solutions could we use to address this situation?" If I could turn now to Veronica. Veronica, like many of the other issues today, this is, of course, a huge topic, but what would be some key recommendations that you would have for what to think about when approaching this kind of challenge? Over to you, Veronica.
Thank you. Indeed, it's a tough one. Well, I will say that despite host community are badly affected by displacement, quite often are not systematically targeted by humanitarian intervention, because there is the perception that host community might have less needs than those people moving into camps, and they should be under the responsibility of the government. However, quite often we see the situation under which the government is quite limited in their capacity to respond to the people's needs. And so during also an emergency situation, host community are exposed to protection and security risk as much as the community living in camps on like camp setting. For example, when we build a camp, especially near rural area, this is put some constraint on the local assets, on the local livelihood and resources. So even indirectly, we do impact we impact also their daily life. I'm personally very familiar with the situation in Myanmar as I was working there. And I can tell you that the camps are built around or in the proximity of small rural villages, leaving them isolated. And this is actually, and that's why it's extremely important to establish a balanced approach, targeting not only people living in camps, but also host community. Personally, what I would suggest is to do the following. For example, it will be very important to meet with the partners working in the same area, meeting with the host community and trying to understand which are their concerns, and highlighting also, try to understand mostly how much their life have changed from the moment the human camp was built near to them. Implement also a need assessment, the service mapping, to analyze the general needs of the population, but also to understand which are the main gaps and why they actually are requesting our support. Identification of persons with special needs, I think, is something that we should also include in our referral pathway, because they have also, when we are engaging with rural areas, sometimes it happens that there are not even resources available to even cure, for example, specific people that have specific needs. Therefore, it is very important to create a good approach, also to include them in our humanitarian assistance. And this also will somehow mitigate the potential escalation of social tension. And I will also, in the meantime, I will also assess the role of those community and ensure that they have a voice in the governance mechanism and structure, especially for whatever concern to resolving like any social disputes. Something I think that it will be very important to understand is that these two communities, the host community and the community in camps, this tension has been created, is a tension that is happening for a while, is some sort of tension that has been in place for years, or is a tension that has been established by our activities because they feel that their needs are not being included. This is a very important question that we need to ask ourselves, and we need to advocate with the cluster, with OCHA, but also with donors, that sometimes we need to include also those people in our activities. We cannot just leave them out of humanitarian assistance. Because another issue that also is coming to my mind is also related to the land agreement. Quite often when we build camp also taking public space. Or sometimes we also, when there is due diligence is not very well done, we also occupy an area or land that's without even the approval of landowner. And so you are also impacting to the daily life. And it is extremely important also to implement due diligence in that sense, in order to try to mitigate all the potential risk. And so I will say that I think a balanced approach is, it might be complicating at the beginning, and sometimes I know that it's quite difficult also to explain, especially to donors, but I believe that a good advocacy should also be done. And if you do, for example, you implement need assessment, also service mapping, and highlight the gaps and the needs, it will be also is a good proof that you can advocate then with the relevant stakeholders.
Very good. Thank you, Veronica. I'd like to then turn to our last area for today's session. Many of the situations that participants wrote in about were related to coordination with partners in camp settings. We selected one example that dealt with coordination really most directly from someone working with an NGO in South Sudan. So this participant writes the following: in the protection of civilian site in South Sudan, where I am working, we have been seeing a series of issues related to coordination among partners, both before and after the COVID-19 outbreak. Accountability efforts in the camps in particular have been uncoordinated, with low participation of partners in meetings, especially after COVID-19. Without accountability efforts being coordinated, this has created additional challenges in overall information sharing between partners and ensuring that the service provision is coordinated. Additionally, a related issue is that stakeholders have been unwilling to discuss strategic and exit planning openly, as many consider it a, quote, sensitive issue. So on this, turning first to Kate, to start us out, the participant mentions accountability in this example. What does this mean in CCCM, and how might there be differences in this among partners that could cause difficulties? Over to you, Kate.
Thanks. There's certainly a lot in this example. So dealing with the accountability question first, and then I wanted to reflect a bit on coordination and coordination difficulties. I think accountability is perhaps one of those, it's a very important concept, but perhaps one of those buzzwords that often gets used and can possibly be quite off-putting, I think, in that, and as you say, understanding actually what we mean. I think for me, in terms of camp management, it's about whether we as service providers are accountable to the camp community, and again, sort of using the word accountable in its own definition there. do we listen to and respond to the community, and are community members involved in not just giving feedback, but also design and implementation? I noticed that the version of the camp management standards, which is available to download in the chat, in section 2 in the document, there's the famous, if you've ever attended a CCCM training, the famous participation arrow, looking at the bottom, information sharing, and looking towards the top at meaningful participation. So concretely then, what does that mean in a camp in terms of how we program? Are there complaints and feedback mechanisms that are available? What's the communication with communities like? Are people able to raise issues, to receive feedback on that? And then what community participation mechanisms are there? And I thought that Tom and Veronica's reflections on what that means, and trying to break away from this idea of having just one camp committee that's somehow representative of everybody, is a really interesting point. I think then that some of the difficulties, and maybe this is what this is driving at in terms of then how do we coordinate sort of accountability as we understand it as these actual really practical program things, complaints mechanisms, how we transfer information, how we receive community feedback. One of the problems that I've come across has been how we marry our own organizational accountability with the requirements of accountability in the camps, so complaints and feedback mechanisms. Sometimes you can end up with multiple complaints mechanisms in the camp because every organization now needs to run one, and as camp management, obviously one of the things that we do is then run an overall camp coordination mechanism. And so I definitely sympathize with the efforts to coordinate around that. And it certainly requires a lot of coordination, a lot of willingness among different organizations to tie that together. So you both can support partners in terms of their own accountability or complaints mechanisms, and then have that overarching one. Moving on to the coordination fatigue. This is definitely something that I sympathize with a lot at the moment, particularly during the COVID time. We've been discussing this recently in the cluster in Iraq. Coordination meetings with low attendance, low contribution with people. It's hard, or I'm finding it hard, running coordination over Zoom. And then, of course, we have the connection issues, etc. I think, and it's something as well that when I've worked with camp management teams, that often struggled with on sort of a cyclical basis in camps, with disinterest of partners in attending coordination meetings, and the poor camp manager is left speaking with one or two different partners. Practically, things that teams I've worked with have found useful is partner participation and coordination. So understanding what the partners want from coordination, whether that's meetings or whether, as someone was saying in the chat box as well, making sure that you've got a really good mapping about who's working where. One thing that's very sort of simple and practical thing that some colleagues when I was working in South Sudan were doing is sending out polls to the partner organizations to understand from them what they wanted from the coordination meetings and try and get them to have a bit more buy-in to that. The content of the meeting, the length and the frequency, and trying to get people to feel like they have helped create something, and then buying in a little bit more to continuing to attend. And then a lot of chasing up as well, and trying to remind people about the importance of it, to remind people about attending the meetings, etc. So yeah, certainly a lot of sympathy with that one. I know it's a very time-consuming issue for a lot of camp management colleagues.
All right, thank you very much. And on the coordination theme, I will be turning to Dare for his reflections on today's discussions generally, sort of picking up from that and going for your reflections, Dare. But before I do that, I would like to ask one quick question to Jennifer. This goes back to the standards. We had a question come in from Axel during the session who mentions the approach "nothing about us without us" and asks, were actual refugees or displaced people involved in working on the development of the standard? Over to you briefly on that, Jennifer.
Sure, it's a great question, and I'm really glad that we have a chance to answer it, because both in face-to-face consultations as well as in online consultations, we had people who had been displaced themselves be able to give feedback. So in Bangladesh and South Sudan, we had open consultations and focus group discussions with men and women who were living in POC sites and in the mega camp. And then in the online survey that we did a year ago with PHAP, we asked specifically that question because we know that a lot of people who are working in CCCM have been displaced themselves and are now colleagues and friends. And the truth is that any of us could be displaced and need to live in an evacuation site. So yes, we are happy to say that unlike other technical standards that have been developed, we have gotten the views from the displaced population themselves.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. So, Dare, I would like to turn to you, as I mentioned, for your reflections on today's discussions. You've heard our panelists share their advice on the camp management challenges that practitioners are experiencing in crisis contexts around the world. What are your main takeaways from the discussion overall? Over to you, Dare.
Decongestion, government and armed actors, community participation, all the tensions with the different involved stakeholders in camp and camp-like setups, and the coordination with the partners. Here, my take from all these discussions are very enlightening, and they just provide a very good example and reassuring that our colleagues who are involved in the CCCM in general are very much informed and well aware about the delicacy and the sensitivity of the work that they are operating in. And indeed, it also gives a clear example that the CCCM is an area that is much wider and it goes far beyond the boundaries of the camps and the camp-like situations. The topics and the inputs, here it was discussed by the colleagues, tell us that we have a goal which basically tries to tell that the camps should be avoided as much and to the extent of possible. And this is our first objective, and our indeed a clear end goal is also to identify durable solutions. And I think here I would also like to say that it seems that our fourth holder, Jennifer, and all the colleagues have been working on this tool. It seems that the efforts have proven to be very much relevant, and all the examples that I'm reading from the chat rooms prove that this document will be very, very useful documents. And I think it is also important that there are surgical inputs in this document, but also it gives reflections and it refers the readers to refer to other very important documents as well. Camp Management Toolkit is mentioned, sphere standards are mentioned, and there are also many other platforms like Women in Displacement platform. I see in the chat room also our colleague Marjolein shared the Women Participation Pilot Project, which has been also one very important and very useful for us, since I see that there was many reference to women in cooperation and women's rule, which is very dilemmatic in our work. Many documents are developed by the CCCM Cluster, but also by WASH and the Protection and Shelter Cluster. So this document is again reflecting and referring on the other document. What I would also like to conclude on my main reflection is that this document relevantly indicates, but all is anchored around few single points. One is standards in camps and camp-like setups are different than anywhere else in the humanitarian response. That's why it is extremely important for all of us to convene the message to the different actors, and that's why it is very important to have CCCM practitioners continue to work in the humanitarian field. The main difference is to avoid having camps to the extent possible, and more to think about the durable solutions as an end goal. Particularly, the document is also important that it refers to different setups that in some documents in the past, they unfortunately were falling through the cracks. We are here not referring to only a camp setup. We are even covering some transit sites, which has been very much, unfortunately, absent from the previous guidelines and the toolkits that we have been developing. So again, we try to bring a document and a guidance and a tool that is more able to freshen the memory, but to bring all the other newly developing and evolving issues into the light. Over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dare. And just briefly, I wonder if you could say something about the timeline for the launch of the standards. Just back to you briefly on that.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank you for asking this question. Indeed, it is important because we have been working on this document for a long time. We don't want to delay it more than it is necessary. We would encourage all the colleagues and the participants to contribute to the survey, share it with the other relevant colleagues. There is no perfect document. We will make sure that we will definitely incorporate the comments. The document has, and the tool has gone through extensive consultation rounds, but we, for the sake of ensuring that the finalization is again well underlined, we are sharing this survey with all of you. With all the inputs we will incorporate, we are aiming towards finalizing this definitely before the end of this year. Over to you.
Okay, very good. Thanks so much, Dare. We're now going to go around the rest of our panel. Again, very briefly, but important to get some final reflections briefly from each of you. So let's go first to Veronica. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to thank you all because it's been a great pleasure to participate on this discussion. I really believe in the work that we, CCCM, are doing, the way we are supporting the affected community, and the great adding value that we are bringing to the humanitarian field. Camp Management Standard is a document that has been written for practitioners and has been also tested, implemented, has had a huge consultation. So I'm very excited also to the launch of this camp management standard. And as Dara said, yes, we do not work only in camps. Camp management is a role and responsibility that we apply also in out-of-camp setting, in area-based approach, and I will always emphasize this. So thank you a lot for this opportunity.
Thank you, Veronica. It was really great to have you on the line. And now to Kate. Over to you for closing remarks.
Thanks very much. Keeping this very brief, it's been an absolute pleasure to participate. And I think probably by far the most active group chat that I've ever seen in one of these webinars. I've been making a lot of notes, a lot of things to think about that have come out of the discussion, and I certainly feel like I've learned a lot as well. And similarly to Veronica, I know how much work has gone into developing these standards, and I think discussing it today is making you realize even more as well how important and useful to our work it's going to be to have this document in place. So thanks very much again.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Kate. It was really terrific to have you as well today. And now we'll turn over to Tom.
I would reiterate the thanks to those in the chat. I am trying to read the chat and it moves too fast, so I will have to read it at the end. I know that there was quite a few comments on the question around the role of women in the camps, around activities and some resources being shared, which is great to see. I think today and the eventual camp management standards document are both testaments to answering the question of what does a camp manager do. As has been noted in one of the case studies, it is often misunderstood And today has shown just how complicated it is, how complex, from just a few small case studies. And what I am sure will happen when the camp management standards is released is that they will help to underpin the answer to the question, what are we actually doing? So yes, I certainly look forward to seeing the final document and working towards that being complete. But again, I would like to thank everyone for their comments.
Great. And thank you, Tom, for your comments and your great insights on all those cases. Really appreciate that. And then finally, to Jennifer, any closing thoughts you'd like to leave with all of us today? Over to you.
Well, just to thank all of the speakers and the hosts and those that were in the chat. We had the chance to walk in camps today, and that is something that not all of us are able to do, but we walked through them and tried to solve problems, which is exactly what the camp management standards are trying to do, is to walk in the shoes of the camp managers, to face those difficult problems and to work together to solve them. So I love the phrase, nothing about us without us, and I think it applies to the standards too. So thank you for hosting this event and for giving us a platform to talk about the important work that happens in camps every day. So thanks very much.
A huge thank you to you also, Jennifer, to all of the panelists again for their inputs, and particularly to all of the participants. You really made it a very rich discussion, as has been mentioned already. The chat, incredibly rich, all of the inputs that you offered yourselves for all of the scenarios that we looked at. Really appreciate that and hope that you'll continue to be an active part of the discussions. And as mentioned earlier, there is a survey launching today where you will have an opportunity to provide your views on the final draft of the camp management standards. So I do hope that you will all take the time to fill that out after the event. You'll also receive the link in the follow-up email. There is a recording of the event that will be available both in video and audio only podcast format that will be available on the event page in the coming days. And I hope that you'll all also join us for other webinars coming up next week. On the 15th of September, we'll be looking at the implications of COVID-19 for crisis financing. And then on the 17th of September, we'll look at how to implement the new IASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian response in the COVID-19 response. Also, as mentioned, we will be following up with speakers. There were a couple of questions, I think, also that came up in the chat that we didn't have time to address on the air. So we will be looking into that with the speakers to see if we can post some written responses to any questions we weren't able to address live on air, and we'll post those in the PHAP community where you can all also continue discussing until the next event on this topic. So with that, once again, a huge thanks to everyone, panelists, participants, also all of the staff behind the scenes who made this possible today. Very interesting and valuable discussion. This is Anne Herod Lang signing off from Geneva. Goodbye.